This video discusses the yield curve. Have a look at this table. What do you see? You see a bunch of dates. And for each date, you will find a bunch of interest rates, which are for different time periods. 1 month, 2 month, 1 year, 2 year, all the way to 30 years. These rates are for United States Treasury. There are similar rates for other governments as well. What these rates denote is the cost of borrowing for United States government for, let's say, 1 year here on 1st April 2022. When you look at the whole series of rates on a certain date, that is the yield curve for that date. So Treasury par yield curve rates. What is par? Means, well, if what is the value of the bond is $100 and the interest rate that would get you to par value is 1.72 for 1 year, right? On 1st April 2022. As you can see, the dates change. On different dates, there are different rates. How do we visualize the change in rates over time? So let's look at this picture here. This is the yield curve, the same rates that I was showing you in graphical form for the 1st April, and this is the yield curve for 18th April. What do we see? We see that the cost of borrowing of United States government has risen at the short end of the curve. This is the short end of the curve, right? The belly of the curve has not risen. And the long end of the curve has risen a lot as well, about 0.5 percentage points. So what does this say? That the cost of borrowing of United States is going up in the month of April, in the first half of the month of April. Why should we care about the cost of borrowing of United States at different maturities? Well, because United States government's cost of borrowing impacts all borrowing costs in United States by corporations, by households. Everybody, when they borrow, the benchmark essentially is the cost of borrowing of the US government. The banks, right? Everybody's cost of borrowing is benchmarked against US government. So as we can see, these days, as the cost of borrowing of US Treasury for the long end of the curve is going up, the long end, mortgage rates are going up, right? It also, as the short end is going up, the cost of borrowing for banks is going up. And banks really care about what is the difference between the short end and the long end of the curve. And that really matters. The short end versus the long end of the curve. And one favorite measure of the markets is the 2-10 spread, 2-year, 10-year spread. So what is the cost of borrowing for 10 years for US government, and subtract the cost of borrowing for 2 years out of that rate. So if this is 3% and this is 2%, then the 2-10 spread is 1%. This is the figure that I am drawing here. It's from the US Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis provides this data very nicely in this picture form. I thank them for it. And what do we see here? We see that the 10-year Treasury is about 1 percentage point more in terms of cost of borrowing compared to the 2-year Treasury. That's what it is, around 1970s, right? 1975. And whenever the cost of borrowing of the 10-year minus 2-year gets close to 0, we can see that there is a gray area after that, right? Not always, but pretty often. Just after this, there is a gray area. And these gray areas are NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, declared recessions, right? So it's not the case that every time the 2-10 spread becomes 0, which is another way to say that the curve, the yield curve has become flat, that there will be a recession. But the idea is that the bond markets, when the cost of borrowing for United States Treasury in the long run becomes almost the same as in the short run, the bond markets are essentially saying that investing in US Treasury in the long run is perhaps the safest investment they can find. And that basically means that the markets are risky, that there is a potential for losses in the markets, and so the bond investors are hiding essentially, or seeking the safety of United States Treasury compared to the riskiness of other investment projects. So essentially, whenever we see the 210 spread flatten out, markets are considering the possibility of a recession later. So that's why the 210 spread is considered as a leading indicator of a future recession. As you can see, the 210 spread came pretty close to zero, but now the 10-year has risen recently, and the 210 spread has risen away from indicating a recession. Thank you very much.